Welcome everyone to another event in the Distinguished Lecture Series hosted by the UCLA Getty Program in the Conservation of Cultural Heritage. Today is February 4th, 2022. I'm Glenn Wharton, chair of the program. I'm pleased to introduce you to our speaker, Sarah Sutton. As a land-grant institution, UCLA and the UCLA Getty Conservation Program acknowledge the Gabrielino Tongva peoples in the traditional land as the traditional land caretakers of the Tovaangar, the Los Angeles Basin and South China Islands. We will hear more today about taking care of our planet and the land that we live on. In our program, we strive to engage with members of the Gabrielino Tongva tribe and other local native populations to share knowledge and learn how best to care for cultural heritage. In her presentation, titled Cultural Heritage and Climate Change, Diplomacy for Neighbors and Nations, Sarah Sutton will address caretaking of cultural heritage and its potential role in the broader effort to address climate change. Sarah is CEO of Environment and Culture Partners, a nonprofit organization working to accelerate cultural institutions' leadership in climate change. The organization manages the Frankenthaler Climate Initiative, a grant program supporting museums, energy efficiency, and clean energy projects, and an Institute for Museums and Library Services National Leadership Grant, creating energy efficient tools for museums. Sarah is the cultural sector lead for America is All in supporting the Paris Agreement. She's co-author of The Green Museum and author of Environmental Sustainability at Historic Sites and Museums. Among many other activities, she's on the steering committee of Held in Trust, a program of the National Endowment for the Humanities and the American Institute for Conservation that is shaping the future of the conservation profession. She's also a member of the American Psychological Association's Climate Change Task Force, and was a selected participant in the International Co-Sponsored Meeting on Climate Change with the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, UNESCO, and International Council of Monuments and Sites. With all of this, I'm pleased that she found time to meet with us today to discuss the role of cultural heritage in conservation and climate change. And before handing it over to Sarah, I would just like to note that given the size of the audience, we won't be able to interact with you, accept live questions, or even through chat. Instead, Sarah and I will engage in conversation for the remainder of the hour at the end of her lecture. And with that, I turn you over to Sarah.
Thank you so much, Glenn. I'm delighted to be here, delighted to be able to talk about something that is so important to me. I'm coming to you from Tacoma, Washington, the land of the Puyallup people. It's bright here today, and that makes me joyful, not just for the light and warmth, but because just yesterday, the utility company installed the meter on my solar panels and turned them on. So I'm generating energy today. This is really important to me because although I have 97% clean energy source here, it's hydro. And the dams that create that power have seriously affected the salmon and herring in the rivers in the Puget Sound. This threatens subsistence and ceremonial practices of all the native nations that live here and affects the health of the Puget Sound and orcas and everything else that live in it. I've only been in Tacoma for 3 years, but I'm in love with it and I want to care for it. Not surprisingly, those themes of carbon, cultural and natural heritage, identity, and special places are all part of today's talk. Now, not everybody sees salmon when they look at my roof, but they could. And I'd like you to be able to see those kinds of things too. Cultural heritage is a valuable, often overlooked community and national resource, especially regarding climate change. And that changes today with all of you. So I'd like you to imagine that you are watching the news and the focus is a recent storm event. It might be a snowstorm, a hurricane, a firestorm, but it's a dramatic climate-driven event. I'm going to tell you what they showed you and talk to you about, and then I'll tell you what I see when they show us this stuff. And some of you cultural heritage professionals might see the same thing as I do. They'll show you entire communities burnt away. The news will focus on the number of power outages as reported by the utility, the amount of salt they're using on the roads if it's a snowstorm. They'll show the waves crashing against the shore, and afterwards, the buildings that had been built on stilts too close to the edge are now all cattywampus on the sand. And then they'll close with a heartwarming piece about neighbors shoveling out a home for a resident who can't, or someone walking car to car on the blocked snowy road with bottles of water. And I think they should lead with those stories. What I and my cultural heritage friends and colleagues see instead of that is the opportunity to restore more thoughtful forest management to limit the fires. I see an historic waterfront and an old factory that now has small businesses in it. I see a row of historic brownstones that each comfortably houses 4 families now instead of just 1. I see the park that is empty during the storm as waves hit the breakwater, but after the storm will be alive and busy once again. I also see acres of heritage landscapes that are carbon sinks and storm surge buffers and cooling spaces outside urban heat islands. Alongside that blocked and frozen road with someone walking along it handing out water, I see a landscape where a tribe has brought back bison for traditional and regenerative agriculture. I also see old factories lining those parking lots that serve as staging places for utility vehicles ready for storm response. And I see all the intellectual and material resources embodied there that hold clues and other ways of knowing and living that could help us sort through these troubles. And I see all the ways that people reach out or connect to create change. Those industries and landscapes and buildings and food sources are all cultural heritage. They're all affected by climate change, but all of them, more importantly, can help us address it. So today's talk is not about how the things that we love are victims of climate change, or even how to protect them, but how they should be used to help us fight climate change and to create local and global agreement on solving the problem. So, did you know there are 35,000 cultural institutions in the United States? And most of them are historic sites and houses, and the rest are museums and zoos and gardens, many of them in historic buildings and at the center of our communities. They safeguard art and crafts and culture as well as species. And this doesn't even count all the historic districts with buildings, plus parks and roads and bridges. It doesn't count the lands and buildings of tribal nations, or all the waterways and clam gardens and salmon spawning beds and forest resources that are cultural heritage. All of this that I've listed is infrastructure. When climate heritage folks look at those resources, they see the opportunity to plan better, to reduce the impact of climate change in the future, and to recover better from climate events. So my talk is going to show you some examples of using those resources to manage climate change and adapt to a changing climate. Then I'll spend some time on cultural climate diplomacy, how it creates neighbor-to-neighbor change and could help us create nation-to-nation change. A key feature of President Biden's climate vision is a nationally determined contribution that is a 50 to 52% reduction in US greenhouse gas emissions by 2030. That is not a random number. It is based on verified calculations of current energy policy and regulation, plus all the related commitments to energy reduction and management from organizations across the US. It counts every sector, public and private, and cultural heritage shows up in each one. Agriculture, building, transportation, education, industry, you name it. To get to that 52%, every single historic building and cultural resource can reduce energy use and then use only clean energy for what it can't eliminate. Historic Environment Scotland has reduced the energy use in Edinburgh Castle so significantly that its carbon footprint is less by 40% now. That's an ancient stone castle, my friends. So let's not be having any more talk about how you can't make an old building in a tough climate more energy efficient. If they did it, we can do it. Our buildings, our old buildings, are green buildings. They harbor carbon. This embodied carbon issue is really, really important. So embodied carbon is the term that I use there. Half of the carbon expended in a building's lifetime is the carbon in the construction phase. So the carbon and other greenhouse gases emitted when those buildings' materials were harvested and reshaped into construction materials, when they were shipped to that spot and then put together, that's the embodied carbon. If you take that building out of use, you throw away that carbon investment. And instead you make a whole nother carbon investment, and then you keep paying by operating it. So investing effort, money, and a little carbon in improving those historic structures we already have is a far more positive climate impact than building a new one, even a super efficient one. New construction will not be greener until we decarbonize the harvesting and manufacture of materials. We will dramatically improve that, but we are not there yet. Right now, when we're hurrying to stop the flow of carbon into the atmosphere and to avoid serious climate change too fast and too soon, if we invested in energy efficiency in the buildings of those 35,000 cultural institutions and the historic districts and historic downtowns, we'd create jobs, support the economy, help the climate, and make a big dent in that 52% carbon goal that the president needs us to help him to get to. We'd be making him and the US look a lot more credible on the climate front for sure. Since we clearly can't build our way out of this climate crisis, let's focus on how that historic carbon investment and our natural and cultural heritage resources can help manage it. So I'm going to shift to slides now. I'm going to give you a quick tour of a few places around the country. I hope you'll see how these resources are valuable community, social, economic, and physical infrastructure. Pause here while I do that. There we go. So this first one is Oklahoma. Wyandotte Nation's Museum and Cultural Center has recovered heritage seeds of corn. Sorry, let me get that last bit out. Wyandotte Nation Cultural Center and Museum has recovered heritage seeds of corn, squash, and beans to grow in its teaching gardens as part of its youth programs. They want to promote traditional foods for a healthier, food-secure community with deeper ties to its own heritage. Rhode Island, Blythewald Mansion and Gardens. The director here joined the city planning task force dealing with sea level rise. As a result, Blythewald aligned its management plan with the need for living shorelines on Narragansett Bay and Bristol Harbor. The shifts they made to their shoreline could have been to armor it with cement or stone groins, but that would displace wave energy onto their neighbors' shorelines, ultimately adding to shoreline loss for them instead. So Blythewald built a land-water interface, a living shoreline, that absorbed wave action and benefited itself and the neighbors, and modeled best practice in the process. New Hampshire, Strawberry Bank Museum, working with city and state partners to research how to prepare its multi-century buildings in the face of sea level rise. High tide, you'll see it here, high tide can fill their basements even on a sunny day, causing saltwater damage to stone and wood structures. The museum is sharing its discoveries with town planners, tradespeople, and the owners of historic homes to help reduce damage and loss for much of the community's historic resources. New York, Brooklyn Botanic Gardens, ornamental ponds are a surprising part of the community stormwater management program. They empty before the storm so that the ponds and the waterways can capture new rainfall. Then they hold it till the storm is passed and the local systems have recovered and they can restore the flow. You can't even tell when you're visiting, unless you read the signs to understand the changes that have been made. California Indian and Cultural Center. They designed an on-site solar generation system with battery storage to prepare for up to 3 days of having to shut down. They'll have enough power during a wildfire to keep cool, fresh air inside the space for the objects and for the people who need to shelter there. Each of these sites contributes to limiting the drivers of climate change or dealing with its impacts. often both, and any site could. They are allies for any community in this climate fight, and they help build resilience to its impact. They can do more, but only if we take advantage of all that they have to offer. And this is where I see their value to diplomacy. And I mean within communities, with neighbors who are from Native groups and government agencies, nations negotiating at the UN Climate Conference, COP. When you care for and celebrate something as cherished and familiar as these resources are, there are fewer reasons for disagreement. Now, the recognition of the value of cultural heritage and climate action has been rising steadily over the past few years. And there is an army of people doing this work, as this list attests to. It might seem like a crowded field, but I guarantee you it is not. We struggle mightily to get our voices heard. We are consistently underfunded and under-recognized, but we are always gaining ground. Since we've been doing this work for up to 2 decades, we've learned a few things. We've learned that facts don't change minds, because if they did, the work of the environmentalists would have, in the 1970s, would have solved this problem already. Conservation psychology tells us that conservation behaviors are tied to identity. If a person sees themselves as an individual or member of a group that cares about places, people, and creatures that are at risk, they will work to protect them. There's no right answer, no right solution, only continuous learning using the best available information. Systems thinking is critical. The climate's a system, so is the society, the economy, and politics. Our responsibility is to create shifts in these systems that create better conditions for all, not for specific interests, and that varied voices always co-create a better solution. So let's think about neighbors. I want to tell you a story from Washington State, here where I am. The tiny Mukai Garden on Vashon Island, Museum and Garden on Vashon Island, historically was an Asian American strawberry farm. Some of its historic lands now support a thriving cidery and active orchards. And the house and the rest of the lands and museum are open to the public. Everyone knows about this place, and if you're a visitor, you know how to get there because museums always have great signage. When the pandemic hit, the museum turned its circular driveway and open spaces into a safe, accessible drive-through COVID testing site, which was far more accessible than getting on a ferry to go off island and find a doctor. This is He'ea Fish Pond, about 20 years ago on the Hawaiian island of Oahu, 800 acres, 800 years old, 88 acres. It was breached by a hurricane in the 1950s and then abandoned. And so it silted in and the trees grew in and it looked like that. But now, with volunteers working to help restore it, they're recreating the sustainable agriculture approach that provides healthy, local, culturally relevant food sources for the community that lives there. And when you visit and volunteer like these folks do, you're asked to speak your name into the history of the place, and then to volunteer with others, share a meal, and create a healthy, climate resilient way for food on Oahu. And there are at least 5 different types of these fish ponds on the islands and hundreds of them coming back into action. But what about fire? So this is an example of nation to nation, neighbor and nation work. The wildfires are worsening due to drought, heat, storms, and the amount of fuel available to burn. Whether it's a housing subdivision or fuel on the forest floor, the diplomacy is in the effort to support indigenous peoples' cultural burning practices as a tool for managing fire and food, and conducting ceremony and traditional practices in this landscape. The diplomacy is also in reconciling these practices with a century of federal regulations. It builds a better understanding of both the problem and the solution, and it's nation-to-nation diplomacy between the sovereign tribal entities and the US government. You see, by the early 20th century, the US government had assigned much of the tribal ancestral lands to the US Forest Service, the National Park Service, and the Bureau of Land Management. That left many tribes with ties to land that they didn't control and couldn't get to. This meant no access for land tending practices such as cultural burns for food and ceremony, no access for hunting or food sourcing. All of this is part of their cultural heritage practice. And during that period, the federal requirements for fire suppression kept fires smaller and burning less fuel. The rule was that you knocked down that fire within 24 hours. For the US government, that worked until it didn't. For the Native nations, it never worked. And now, for the combination of communities built on the edge of forest habitat, the fire practices leaving more fuel to burn, and the climate-driven heat, it doesn't work for anyone. Climate change makes conditions different enough that the native knowledge can no longer keep up with adaptation. And now neither the native nor the Western path can effectively address such a complex, ever-changing threat under these climate conditions. Instead, the approaches have to be blended. And we're seeing in partnerships between the Klamath and the federal government and among the Carrick and Yurok tribes in California with their scientist research partners, that the blended management approach offers hope for a just and realistic response to this crisis that we have not had before. And in this case, diplomacy on both sides brings new resources for all. So what about diplomacy nation to nation? In 2017, when President Trump stepped out of the Paris Agreement, a whole bunch of organizations stepped in to hold the door open. They came together as a coalition called We Are Still In. I'm proud to say that the cultural sector is a very active partner in that coalition. By the time President Biden took office, there were 4,000 plus cultural institutions, colleges and universities, investors, churches, hospitals, tribal nations, and city and state governments and businesses of all kinds doing the climate work that the government should have been encouraging. On January 22nd, 2021, President Biden took us back into the Paris Agreement, and we went from being We Are Still In to America is All In, offering ourselves to the administration as supporters and provocateurs to keep it and the world advancing on its climate goals. And in April 2021, when the president announced the NDC, the Nationally Determined Contribution goal of 50 to 52%, he listed all of those sectors, including cultural institutions, as part of the grounding for that goal. Every single one of those organizations I listed on the earlier slide, starting with Getty Conservation Institute and ending with Environment and Culture Partners, has been doing the groundwork to make this possible so that cultural heritage could contribute and be recognized at a national and now a global level. So you've probably heard a lot about the Glasgow Climate Conference. You might have heard that it was a failure. I disagree. I disagree strongly. I had the pleasure and joy of being there and learned firsthand why it was so successful. So the climate assessments by the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, the IPCC, are what the UN, the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change, the UNFCCC, and the 193 global governments use to create their climate policies. The countries create their own policies, but countries create their own policies, but they contribute to the global climate effort to keep the climate warming below 2 degrees centigrade. That's the news headline of the conference, like this one that you see here. COP is where they have to negotiate nation-to-nation negotiations about fossil fuel elimination and cutbacks. They also negotiate how to compensate nations who have contributed so little to climate change and yet are being seriously threatened. And a whole host of other issues like agricultural practices, reforestation, gender equity, education for girls, indigenous land rights, and water management. For these COP negotiations to be completed, 193 nations have to agree. And you can only agree to what you can take back home and accomplish. So whether you're Emmanuel Macron or Joe Biden, you have to take the agreement home and implement it. So the present president could not commit to as much as I wanted him to. But not all the work that will make a difference in that 50 to 52% domestic goal will get done in the high profile negotiations. It gets done before and after the nations head to COP, and it gets advanced in the hallways and the meeting rooms, as well as the negotiations. And that's what encourages me so much. You might have heard about the Global Methane Pledge. It's an international commitment to reduce methane production by 30% by the year 2030. The work on that pledge started way before COP, and then it took place during COP, in the hallways and in the meeting rooms. By the third day of COP, the US and the EU had brought this agreement to COP to be discussed. 3 days later, over 100 other signatories had joined on. This methane reduction is going to help us slow climate change. The news focuses on one thing, but we see and hear all the other conversations going on during COP that lay the groundwork for other levels of progress once we get home. So this is a shot of the inside of the World Wildlife Fund and the America is All In Pavilion at the Conference of the Parties. So there are high-level negotiations, and then there are football fields worth of 190 plus pavilions like this, where the nations and the individuals and the NGOs who are doing the work of climate action get together and talk about how we're going to do this better. This is the All-In Pavilion. This is where state governors and Administrator McCarthy and senators and representatives came to talk about what was going on and to hear from all of us who attended as observers. And we told them what we felt needed to happen and how we thought we could help. And I can tell you with absolute confidence that the professional commitment and demeanor of every negotiator, every agency staffer, every politician I met was impressive. They knew their facts, they knew the science, and they knew when they didn't know the facts or they didn't know the science, and they never overpromised. I left very confident that especially with the agency leadership and staff and the climate negotiators whose names you'll never hear, we have rock solid colleagues, super committed to getting us where we need to be. Now, cultural heritage representation has grown exponentially at COP over the last few years. It's primarily due to the efforts of the Climate Heritage Network and through We Are Still In and America Is All In. And we are all proud to be able to participate. Now I'm going to stop sharing now, but still present. There, I can see you again. As a result, last December, the IPCC, for the first time, held meetings with 100 of us representing the global cultural sector, advising them on how to include cultural heritage in its scientific reports. For the next IPCC report, 193 nations are going to have access to information about how to use cultural heritage for combating climate change and for creating just and resilient communities. That meeting statement covered just what we've been going over here today, how intangible cultural heritage practices and the use of traditional architecture and building materials can help communities mitigate and adapt to a changing climate, and that cultural and natural heritage sites can serve as refuge, both physical and psychological, for communities during and after climate-related emergencies. Inclusion in the IPCC report is critical because without it, policymakers at every level overlook the value of cultural heritage as one of their great negotiation tools. Remember that I said conservation has to do with identity? Commitment to tackling climate change hinges on how our values align with conservation of the planet and with the health and well-being of everything on it. Not every person will value heritage equally or value each other's heritage, but every community and every nation has cultural heritage as the foundation of its identity. They have cultural heritage they wish to protect and share. This is a basic value that can be a platform for more conversations for diplomacy, for creating commitments to tackling climate. You know how nations always bring out culture when they want to make a statement about what's important to them. We see cultural identity on display at the opening of every Olympics. When leaders come together around the world, they meet at the country's cultural institutions. I was unable to get into the Calvin Grove Art Gallery and Museum in Glasgow because all the national leaders were there. And we see, as cultural heritage professionals, we see cultural diplomacy in action every day as countries and cultural institutions repatriate stolen art and artifacts. Kathleen Barron has written a great book on the US as the host of international art exhibits before, during, and after the Second World War as cultural diplomacy. Raph DeBont has written about diplomacy in natural lands and species conservation. And Natalia Grincheva has written about museums as diplomatic assets, global diplomatic assets. Cultural heritage has those same qualities. They have parallels with some sort in every country where people care for them and care about them. DeBont writes that cultural diplomacy is valuable when it mobilizes audience and attracts a wide constituency to support cultural causes of diplomatic significance. We need to do it again with climate. Acknowledge that we all have heritage we value and that the steps we take independently and together help us care for that heritage. The 2009 Salzburg Declaration on the Conservation and Preservation of Cultural Heritage was written by representatives of 32 nations. It recognizes that our global cultural heritage strengthens identities, well-being, and respect for other cultures and societies. Cultural heritage is a powerful tool to engage well-being and respect, to engage communities positively, creates an appreciation of diverse cultural heritage and its continuity for future generations, and promotes mutual understanding between people, communities, and nations. I was not a member of that Salzburg group, but I have a valued colleague, Deborah Hess Norris, who was. She is as concerned about climate and cultural heritage as I am. But I suspect that the statement wasn't written with climate change in mind, as much as if they had to write it now. Still, it was created with the goal of global understanding and well-being reinforced through cultural heritage. What I'm advocating for is that cultural diplomacy should be deployed as part of climate diplomacy. Diplomacy at home, among neighbors, in communities, between native nations and the federal government, means that the next COP negotiating team can commit the US to more because they know the president can come back home and be able to implement it. The reason that I and Stephanie Shapiro go to COP is to tell people that cultural heritage is important to climate action and to show how we use it to mitigate, adapt, and become more resilient. You can do this too without going to COP. You can talk about climate change and how it's important to you that we address it, and then you can take steps in the public view. So after Glenn and I take a few minutes now to talk together, the webinar will end and the screen will close. And there are two things I hope that you'll feel ready to do. Talk about climate change and model practice. These are the two most important actions involving tackling climate change. Talk about the climate to normalize it rather than let it remain stuck in partisanship. Talk to your neighbor, your representative, your governor, your employer, your children, and then model it to spread it. You'll be amazed how much others will notice when you turn out the lights or use a cloth handkerchief, buy local food, or take the bus. And each time that you do it, imagine me back here in Tacoma telling my neighbors about salmon while I'm looking at the solar panels on my roof, and I will be cheering you on, saying, good job, go get them. Thanks for listening.
Thank you, Sarah, so much. What a really wonderful presentation. And you've reminded me why we set up this series of distinguished lectures in the first place, to invite people in from adjacent fields or from other fields to reflect on the work that we do in cultural heritage conservation. And you just provided a wonderful roadmap for us to rethink why we are doing this, why we are preserving tangible and intangible heritage from the past. We talk a lot about the importance of building individual and group identity through the work that we do, through connecting people to their pasts. I mean, there's so many questions I have. I'd love to talk about international, national, local policies for fighting climate change, but I'm going to keep this to cultural heritage conservation, since that's our framing here. I think maybe I'll just start with maybe this is a statement, not a question. I'll let you respond to it, and if not, I'll move on to some real questions. One of the things I'm thinking, or you reminded me of, is that in our discussions about the role of cultural heritage in the development of identity, we work very hard to engage populations associated with cultural heritage to help them establish this identity, but also we realize that they already have not only identity, but their own concerns about how cultural heritage is conserved and presented, and how the past is narrated through our efforts. We are also aware that cultural heritage can be used for nefarious purposes by authoritarian regimes that try to build their identity on imagined pasts. So this is what also came up in my mind, just thinking about how this is all going to play out as we reframe conservation in this way. I'm also reminded of the debates that have been going on, at least since the 18th century, that really heated up in the 19th century about adaptive reuse, about preservation versus restoration of the built environment, whether we should, for instance, change a church into a community center, and the conflicting groups that might want to use the building. Who do we honor? So it gets very complicated very fast once we enter into the discussion of adaptive reuse and using cultural heritage as not just, as you say, a victim, but as a tool for fighting climate change. So that's more of a statement. I don't know if you want to respond in any way about the complexities of actually making this happen, what you're recommending here.
Well, I do have some thoughts that connect to it. And one of them is certainly the doctrine of do no harm. And it's do no harm to the object when you go and care for it. When you choose to accept responsibility for it, you have to be able to care for it so that it's not harmed. And it includes do no harm to the rightful owners or caretakers of that same object or the story that goes with it. So it's a moving target. What is harm? Harm to whom? And how do you negotiate and navigate that? And so in that list of things that we've learned, the last two were systems and groups working together. More voices is better. It's not easier, but you're more likely to get a more thoughtful response if more voices are considered in it and able to appreciate each other when they're doing the work to figure out what is the best path forward. Now, I get stuck and don't have any good answers when you think about how long do we protect these things for? When we have objects in a museum, we want to care for them for forever. And we want to, and as cultural professionals, the last line of defense for caring for them, we want to give them the best conditions ever. And then do that forever and save everything. We don't have that capacity anymore. And we have to start making some choices and figuring out what we're saving for whom and for how long. That's really going to be complicated. I don't have good answers for that. I do believe we're building the skills, the diplomatic skills, to do that better. I wouldn't say we're terrific at it yet, though.
That was a great response. And you also made me think a little bit further in your response that the way we are working these things out, these very complicated situations with multiple stakeholders with different points of view, is through collaborative partnerships and looking at identifying who the stakeholders are, the professionals with the skills of doing the work, but also the communities associated with the cultural heritage. And I guess now we're adding in climate scientists and politicians and others, and not to mention funders, to devise projects on a very local individual basis with each element, whether it's a building, a site, an object, or an oral or cultural tradition, to investigate how this could be used as a tool to fight climate change, and get around the table, get everyone's opinion, and then build out possibilities.
Well, and so some of the people in the audience might have known me when I was Sustainable Museums. So that was my sole proprietor's business for a bunch of years, decades. And in the summertime, Stephanie Shapiro and I created Environment and Culture Partners, a nonprofit, in order to do this work, to scale action throughout the sector. And partners is in the name because what you said about partnerships. No single entity knows enough or can make enough happen, that the partnerships are critical for it. It not only does it bring enough brains to the topic, but it brings enough capacity to scale change at a rate that we need to create change. The climate change is fast, and it's getting faster. And the iterative, careful approach that cultural institutions tend to take to decision-making and planning and implementation just is out of sync with that, which makes it a little harder for us to manage. But when we're in partnerships with people who are more attuned to that or more comfortable working in that way, it gets easier. So the partnerships are critical. More partners is usually helpful, but you do have to scan and find out who should be in the conversation. And you might miss the first time around. I mean, miss out somebody the first time around. Have the grace and decency to acknowledge that and to invite them in when hopefully they raise their hand and they said, you forgot about us. Because that's your opportunity to learn, to expand the group, and to get a better result for everyone out of it.
Yes, thank you. And now my mind is going to a whole other topic that is probably, again, more of a statement than a question. So maybe it's because all of this is so complicated that I can't just, boil my response to real simple questions for you. But it's about how our field is somewhat culpable in the outsized carbon footprint of museums. And, starting back in the 1970s, if not before, there was a lot of research going on about the reaction that artifacts and fine arts have in museums when the environment when the relative humidity in the environment is changing, whether the objects get dry and then they get moist and they split and they crack and paint pops off of paintings. And so we insisted as a field that the museums adopt really stringent regulations, keeping it between 45–55% relative humidity. This led to not only the expense of really expensive HVAC systems, but backup systems and then the carbon footprint. So the field, I'm very pleased to report that over the last 15 or 20 years, we've really been rethinking this, and with sort of the realization that we need to back off to some extent and negotiate, allow museums to be a little bit more humid in the summer in the Northeast, for instance, a little drier in the winter, maybe a little cooler in the winter, and that the artifacts will actually, many of the artifacts will survive. They always have, before we, in the 1970s, insisted on these stringent regulations. So, you know, it's been an interesting process to watch over the last couple of decades as there's been a kind of a reckoning within the field. So as I said, this is more of a comment, but if you have a response, that would be great, or I can move on to some other questions.
I have two things to share about that. Stephanie Shapiro and I have been interviewing folks in the field in order to understand why that more flexible range hasn't necessarily been adopted as much as one would assume when you're focused on energy. And we hope to really restart that conversation. And because I think there's more appetite and more confidence among practitioners to raise their voices and say, this is important. As a sector, we need to confirm across the board that this is something we can support and recommend, rather than hoping that it trickles down from the few places that have it as an anchor. So we think we're ready to reestablish that more thoroughly with some poking and prodding, which Stephanie and I definitely plan to do. But we could also use some more research on how does that really affect our energy footprint. And although it's not a focus of the project we're on, it's included. So in the introduction, you mentioned Culture Over Carbon. That's an IMLS-funded national leadership grant to the New England Museum Association that we are running with New Buildings Institute out of Portland, Oregon, that looks at the energy footprint of the cultural sector. And what we're doing is taking the energy information from up to 400, maybe it'll be 500 institutions, but for a smaller chunk of them, we're doing individual assessments of their energy use over a 1-year period that tells us a little bit about how that particular building operates. And before the folks at NBI process all of that in any energy information, they look at the characteristics of the building and how it's operated. And we made sure that some of the questions in there are about those temperature and relative humidity controls, so that we can see if there's any signal in the data that tells us, good news, bad news, whatever news, about how that's playing out in the sector. And we think that will tell us a lot about next steps for research, but also immediate response. What kind of information can we learn from that? We don't have as much research on the implementation part on energy. We do on objects, but on energy. And we'd like to figure out how to chase that better. I think it would be valuable for all, and it would give some folks more courage to take it on when right now they're just sort of waiting for the right opportunity.
Yes, I couldn't agree more. More research needs to be done, and we need to act right now. So, but you know, and I think conservators and conservation scientists have really come kicking and screaming to the table here, because we have been fighting, and you know, there had been research on wood splitting and canvas paintings, you know, paint flaking off with fluctuations of relative humidity and temperature. Yet I think as a field, we're coming to realize that we just can't keep arguing this, that saving art and culture is only one part of the equation here. We also need to save the earth, and museums should not be leaders in destroying the earth. They should be finding ways at which you're advocating to be the tools through engagement and diplomacy for fighting climate change. But more research does need to be done on the science, the experience of these objects in museums, but also on the other side, how we can protect the objects while lowering carbon footprint at the same time. So I think we're just still on the cusp of that. And so if we have quite a large audience today, we have hundreds and hundreds of people. So if there are any funders out there, be thinking about supporting this kind of research that involves science, but also, as we spoke before, partnerships.
Yeah. So my friend and co-author Elizabeth Wiley will say we can, in perpetuity, care for collections, but the place that houses the collection is the planet and its climate. And if we destroy that, then why were we putting all that effort into saving the objects? And we have to think about it that way. We can't damage the package and then not be able to keep the materials. It just doesn't make any sense.
Yeah. Well, time is going fast, and I would like to address a few other topics. One possibly quick question that I have is just on the term sustainability. Many of us are using it and we define it very differently. And I've had to come to realize that it embraces much more than just environmental sustainability. It also embraces, at least the way I'm thinking about it now, social, cultural, and even economic sustainability. Do you have any response to that, either how you define it or what you've come to with this term?
With really complex topics, it usually eventually can be narrowed down to a very simple concept that is a core in order to support all of the varied aspects. And so I use the approach to make all of my decisions so that everyone and everything can thrive. If I make my choice that way, it's sustainable economically, socially, environmentally, for everyone and everything. So that's what I use as my guidance.
Okay, that's helpful, and that's very good, good framing. Now a completely different topic, and I don't know if you will be able to answer this one or not, but I'm just thinking about our present circumstance with COVID, and we still have this pandemic raging. I would like to think that we're turning a corner now, but we've all been living a very different life over the last couple of years. Do you see anything about our experiences that could be applied to our fight to mitigate climate change?
I see many. And so when this started 2 years ago, all of us at America's All In, we came together and we thought, oh my gosh, we're just going to have to shut up for a while. You know, people were dying around us, and talking about the environment and climate for the future just sounded tone deaf. And so we stopped. But it only took another couple of weeks before we started looking at each other and saying, this sounds familiar. We know this. This is what we do every day, because of the parallels between the social, economic, and health crisis and climate change. This is a situation where individual behavior change is required so that everybody benefits. It's a situation where individuals experience COVID-19 or the economics or the climate aspect. They experience something individually, but it's also in the community. That to tackle it requires the best available science that gets adapted day to day, frustrating as that might be. It requires that individual behavior change, and it requires a recognition that sometimes you make a decision even though you don't immediately benefit. And that happens all the time with climate change. If we are not as impacted in the United States as somebody is in Tuvalu, somebody is in Benin. So we will be making changes that will benefit them more than us, perhaps. And for some people, that's a problem. And that's a parallel with COVID and economics and all sorts of issues. They're systems issues. They have so much that are related. And when we're able to step back and see that, we realize we've developed so many skills for addressing climate change. And one last thing, if anybody has watched Don't Look Up, it's just a marvelous parody. I saw myself in it so many embarrassing times, but also some encouraging times as well. But my son works at a grocery store, and his boss told him that the movie was about COVID-19, not climate change. And for a moment I thought, oh, missed it. And then I thought, no, wait a minute. He's understanding that those that there are parallels there. And eventually he'll recognize them for climate change or social equity, something else. But he saw what that connection was. He saw the parallels and someday make the connection. And I think that exercise in seeing the parallels is incredibly valuable. Learning to change your behavior takes practice. They don't get it right. Nobody gets it right away. We need to allow everyone a little bit of time to practice and take up these new activities, but keep encouraging them to do it. Don't relax. It's work we have to do sooner rather than later.
Don't look up. It's now on my list. Okay, I will be watching it. Well, we only have a few more minutes, and you sort of brought it to the personal, and I would like to end with that anyway. You're such a positive force, whereas many of us, or some of us anyway, are just deeply depressed about climate change, wondering like, what can we do? I mean, the forces are too big, the geopolitical power structures in place, and the, aside from sorting my garbage, what can I do? And I would just like to hear from you. I know you mentioned solar panels on your roof, but what else can people do on an individual basis to do their part in fighting climate change with cultural heritage as a tool or not?
Well, first we'll acknowledge that I've wanted to have solar panels for 15 years. And only now have I been able to accomplish that. And so I look at all of the opportunities as what I've done, what I'm doing now, and what I'm going to do. And I can't do all of it. I can only do what I'm doing now, what is available to me. And there are lots of things available to any person to do. So how do you choose among them? And you center yourself on your values. What makes the biggest difference to me that is important in a way that's important to making sure everyone and everything can thrive, and use that as the compass for making the decision. In my little community here, there aren't a lot of solar panels. When I put them up on my roof facing the road, everybody sees it. They all walk by on the way to the farmer's market, and we can have a conversation about it. I can grow food on my property and have chickens. Those are things that I can do. But last night I was at Green Drinks. We were learning about a startup company that's removing PFAS. I can't even pronounce it. The technical term for a terrible chemical that lasts forever, that gets trapped in the environment and needs to be physically removed. We can learn, we can try things, and we can encourage each other. So it doesn't really matter where you start, except that you do start, and then have confidence that what you learn while you're starting will make it easier for you to do the next thing. And I promise you, it is addictive. Once you get started, you just keep doing the next thing. So when you feel like you're losing confidence, you call me up and say, what should I do next? Which is what I do. I call on my board and my friends and my colleagues, and I tell them that this is a bad day. And they tell me about the good days, and they remind me, and we get back up and we go and we do it again, because there isn't an alternative. But when you're out there, the people who are doing this work are committed and positive and confident and learning. Those are the people I want to play with. So that's what I choose. Okay, well, that's very inspirational. And maybe I'll just say a word about some of what we're doing here at UCLA Getty Conservation. Where our lab manager, William Shelley, is working very hard to green our lab because we've realized that we're using a lot of chemicals and toxic substances. So he's looking from top to bottom about how we can change what we're doing. And our students are also, some of our doctoral students are researching more sustainable methods in conservation. But our MA students are all right now, for a class that I'm teaching, researching more sustainable methods of treating archaeological bronzes. So they're looking at the literature, they're testing what's already out there, and they want to write a paper on this. So it's just so exciting to see
the younger generation just
Mhm.
taking this on and moving forward. We have a National Endowment for the Humanities grant to develop curricular materials for our courses to engage with sustainability.
Mhm.
So more sustainable treatment methods, but also just sustainable, readings and topics to integrate our syllabi. And the idea is that we will develop this out and make these materials available internationally for other conservation educators to download and adapt. So we're fighting the fight on our home front as well.
That's good, because everybody wants to have a part, and not everybody can install solar panels or get their boss to go green, right? You have to start where you're in charge. And if that's your desk, your lab, your whole institution, whatever it is, start there. That sounds marvelous.
Okay, Sarah, you are an inspiration. Thank you so much for joining us today, and I look forward to watching all of your activities as you're out there in the world with all these important projects that you're doing. So
Well,
thank you.
it was a pleasure. Thank you for having me.